It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon outside Buckingham Palace. Tourists snapping photos, guards standing stoic, and a man walking his dog. But in a single, reckless moment, everything changed. A pit bull lunged, a royal guard broke centuries of protocol, and a stunned crowd watched as an unthinkable decision had to be made. What pushed the guard to abandon his post? And how did one tourist's careless mistake turn into a life-altering lesson about respect, responsibility, and humanity? It was one of those perfect London afternoons where the sky, often blanketed in clouds, made a rare and generous offering of sunlight. The warmth brought Buckingham Palace to life, its stone facade gleaming under the soft golden rays. A crowd gathered outside the ornate black and gold gates, their voices a gentle hum, blending with the rhythmic clicking of cameras and the occasional chirp of pigeons pecking at stray crumbs. Tourists from all corners of the world flocked to this iconic landmark, eager to witness the stoic royal guards in their traditional red tunics and towering bearskin hats. They stood still, statuesque, their expressions unflinching, embodying centuries of tradition. It was here that Tom, a tourist from the United States, found himself, camera slung over one shoulder, a map poking out his backpack, and at his side his pit bull, Max, tugging eagerly at his leash. Tom was in his late 20s, wearing casual cargo shorts and a loose t-shirt, sunglasses perched atop his head. He exuded the carefree energy of someone far from home, soaking in the sights without the weight of routine. Max, on the other hand, was anything but calm. His muscular frame strained against the leash as he sniffed at the air, his sleek, tan coat gleaming in the sun, tail wagging in short bursts as people passed by. Tom crouched beside Max, rubbing the dog's ears affectionately. "You seeing this, buddy? These guys don't flinch at anything," he said, motioning toward the royal guards. Max responded with an eager bark, attracting the attention of nearby tourists. A small group chuckled at the sight, a man and his dog, enjoying the moment. But Tom's eyes lingered on the guard standing closest to them. The guard's face was unreadable, jaw clenched, eyes fixed forward, hands gripping the rifle across his chest. Tom had read somewhere that the royal guards weren't allowed to react, no matter what. It fascinated him. He wondered what it would take to break that stillness. The square was alive with simple joys, children on their parents' shoulders, elderly couples holding hands, teenagers taking selfies with the stoic guards in the background. It felt safe, orderly, even peaceful. Street performers played soft tunes on violins, adding to the ambience, while vendors sold ice cream and miniature Union Jack flags. Tom, feeling the buzz of the moment, glanced at Max, whose tongue lolled out in a panting smile. "You'd never hurt anyone, huh?" he murmured, scratching under Max's chin. Yet even as he said it, a spark of mischief ignited within him, the kind of thought that flits through the mind uninvited. A what if? Before common sense steps in. But this time, Tom didn't push it aside. He wanted to see something different, something beyond the rehearsed calm of the palace grounds. Max barked again, this time more forcefully, snapping Tom out of his thoughts. The dog had spotted a pigeon landing just a few feet away and lunged forward, nearly pulling Tom off balance. Laughter rippled through the crowd as the pit bull skidded to a halt, held back only by the sturdy leash. A woman nearby smiled at Tom. "He's got quite the energy," she said in a British accent. "Yeah, he's a handful," Tom replied, chuckling. But even as he smiled, his eyes returned to the guard. The man hadn't even flinched at Max's sudden lunge. Tom marveled at that level of discipline. It felt almost unnatural, inhuman, to remain so unaffected. Max, still amped up from chasing the pigeon, let out a deep, throaty growl. Not aggressive, just spirited. The sound made a few people glance over. Tom noticed the subtle shift in the crowd's attention. He felt a twinge of excitement. He wasn't trying to be malicious, but there was something enticing about the idea of breaking through the guard stone facade. It wasn't about the dog, really, it was about testing the boundaries. Tom took a deep breath, feeling a strange cocktail of nerves and adrenaline. He tightened his grip on Max's leash, giving the dog a gentle tug to bring him closer. "All right, buddy," he whispered. "Let's see if these guys are really made of stone." Nearby, a father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders, pointing toward the palace. A couple posed for a photo, the woman giggling as her partner attempted a mock salute like the guards. The peacefulness of the square was palpable, almost sacred in its predictability. But beneath that surface, a ripple had begun, a small, almost imperceptible shift in energy. Tom's innocent curiosity was morphing into something more reckless. Max, unaware of his owner's intentions, sniffed the air again, catching the scent of the guard. His ears perked up, and his tail wagged in anticipation. Tom crouched next to him one more time, whispering in his ear, encouraging the dog to edge closer to the guard. He wasn't planning anything harmful, just a little push to see if the guard would react. As Tom stood back up, tightening the leash ever so slightly, a gentle breeze swept through the square. The leaves of the nearby trees rustled softly, and a flock of pigeons scattered into the air, their wings flapping in chaotic harmony. It was as if the very air sensed the tension about to unfold. The guard remained still, his boots firmly planted, his eyes unblinking behind the tall bearskin hat. The crowd, unknowingly on the brink of witnessing something extraordinary, continued their peaceful afternoon, until the delicate balance shattered with a single, sharp bark from Max, breaking through the ambient hum of the square. The sharp bark from Max cut through the air like a crack of thunder, jolting the nearby crowd out of their casual afternoon reverie. Heads turned instinctively toward the source of the noise, eyes widening as they caught sight of the muscular Pitbull lunging forward, his leash stretched taut in Tom's grasp. Max's growl deepened, the low, rumbling sound vibrating through the ground as he fixated on the nearest royal guard. His stance was powerful, legs braced, chest low to the cobblestone path, every muscle tensed in anticipation. Tom's heart raced as he tightened his grip on the leash, trying to control Max's sudden burst of energy. He hadn't expected such an aggressive reaction. This was supposed to be a harmless bit of fun, a way to crack the legendary composure of the Royal Guards. But now, with Max growling and baring his teeth, the situation had taken on an edge Tom hadn't foreseen. He glanced nervously at the crowd, noticing the shift in their expressions. Moments ago, there had been smiles and laughter. Now, there were furrowed brows and uneasy whispers. "Whoa, Max. Easy, buddy," Tom hissed, yanking the leash backward. But the dog was locked in, focused entirely on the stoic figure just feet away. The guard stood motionless, his tall bearskin hat casting a shadow over his face, making it impossible to read his expression. His gloved hands gripped his rifle firmly, but he made no move to react, adhering strictly to the unbreakable code of conduct drilled into every royal guard. Tom felt a rush of adrenaline, mixed with growing anxiety. He hadn't meant for things to escalate, but now that the crowd's attention was firmly on him and Max, a dangerous sense of obligation to follow through crept into his mind. Part of him told himself it was all still harmless. After all, Max was leashed and the guard wasn't reacting. Another part, though, recognized that the situation was teetering on the edge of control. A small group of tourists edged closer, their phones raised, capturing the unfolding moment. Children peered from behind their parents, some giggling at the dog's antics, others clutching tighter to protective hands. The air was thick with anticipation, a collective, unspoken question. Would the guard finally break protocol? Tom crouched next to Max again, speaking softly but urgently. "Come on, boy. Just a little bark. That's all. Show them what you got." He tugged the leash forward, encouraging Max to inch closer. The Pitbull responded immediately, his growl intensifying as he lunged again, this time closing the gap between himself and the guard. His front paws scraped against the cobblestones, claws clicking as he strained against the restraint. The guard didn't flinch. A bead of sweat slid down Tom's temple, despite the cool breeze still sweeping through the square. His nerves were fraying, but he felt trapped between stopping now, admitting defeat in front of the crowd, or pushing a little further to force the reaction he thought he wanted. Max let out another ferocious bark, his body shaking with the force of it. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. "Sir, control your dog," a stern voice barked from somewhere in the crowd, but Tom barely registered it. His focus was locked on the guard, watching for the slightest movement, a twitch, a flinch, anything. Max lunged again, this time so forcefully that Tom stumbled forward, nearly losing his grip on the leash. The dog's snapping jaws came within inches of the guard's legs. The tension in the air thickened to the point of suffocation. It was no longer a game. The pit bull's snarls echoed through the square, mingling with the gasps and murmurs of the crowd. Still, the guard remained unshaken. For a brief moment, Tom felt a flicker of anger. At himself, at the guard, at the situation spiraling out of his control. "Seriously? Nothing," he muttered under his breath, trying to regain his footing. But in that instant, something shifted in Max. The dog's agitation reached a boiling point. and with a powerful tug, he broke free from Tom's grip. The leash slipped through Tom's hands like a rope slick with oil. "Max!" And "Oh!" he shouted, panic surging through his veins. Max bolted forward, closing the final gap between himself and the guard. His teeth bared, growls guttural, he lunged at the guard's legs. The crowd erupted into chaos, screams, shouts, and frantic movements as people scrambled backward, fearing an imminent attack. And that's when it happened. In a fluid, precise motion, the royal guard broke protocol. He stepped sideways, narrowly avoiding Max's snapping jaws, his black boots scraping against the stone. With one swift, controlled movement, he raised his rifle, not to fire, but to block the charging Pitbull. The barrel came between him and Max, creating a barrier. "Step back and secure your animal," the guard barked, his voice sharp and commanding, slicing through the panic like a knife. The crowd froze. The moment felt surreal. The stoic, silent figure had become human in an instant, forceful, authoritative, and very much present. Tom, wide-eyed and breathless, stumbled forward, grabbing at Max's leash as the dog lunged again, snapping at the rifle's metal barrel. "Max! Heel! Heel!" Tom's voice cracked with desperation as he yanked the leash, trying to pull the Pitbull away. Max resisted, his instincts still driving him forward, but Tom finally managed to drag him back, wrapping the leash around his wrist for extra grip. The guard didn't lower his rifle. His eyes, now visible beneath the brim of his hat, were sharp and focused. He kept his stance firm, ensuring there was no further threat. The crowd was silent, save for the heavy breathing of Tom and the low growls of Max. Even the pigeons had taken flight, leaving an eerie stillness in the aftermath. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he avoided eye contact with the guard, shame washing over him in hot waves. His hands trembled as he pulled Max further back, the Pitbull finally starting to calm, his growls fading into heavy panting. For the first time, Tom realized the weight of what he'd done. What had started as a harmless prank had spiraled into something dangerous, something real. He glanced at the crowd, noticing their wide-eyed stares and disapproving glances. But what struck him most was the guard. The man had broken protocol, not to retaliate, not out of fear, but to protect. There was something profoundly humbling in that realization. As Tom secured Max and took a shaky breath, he couldn't shake the growing knot in his stomach. He had crossed a line he hadn't even realized was there, and now, standing in the aftermath, he felt the crushing weight of that mistake. The square hung in an eerie silence, the air charged with tension that refused to dissipate. Tom stood frozen, his chest heaving, Max still straining slightly against the leash, his growls now replaced with panting. All eyes were fixed on the royal guard. This stoic figure who, for the first time since the ordeal began, had stepped out of the immovable role he was bound to. His black boots were planted firmly on the cobblestone, rifle still raised defensively between himself and the Pitbull. But something deeper had shifted, something unspoken that rippled through the crowd like a current. The royal guards were notorious for their discipline. Stories were legendary, guards standing motionless through brutal weather, insults, even physical provocations, all without so much as a blink. But this moment shattered that mythology. The guard had broken rank, violated centuries-old protocol, not out of weakness or fear, but from an instinct more profound, protection. Tom's hands trembled as he tightened his grip on Max's leash, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The guard's voice still echoed in his ears. "Step back and secure your animal." The authority in that command had cut straight through the chaos, grounding everyone, even the frenzied dog. But now, with Max secured and the threat neutralized, there was a heavy, suffocating stillness. The guard slowly lowered his rifle, the black barrel gleaming under the pale afternoon sun. His gloved hands moved with precision, the years of rigid training evident in every controlled motion. But what caught Tom off guard was the subtle shift in the man's posture. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but spoke volumes. His shoulders, once stiff and squared, now seemed weighed down, as if burdened by the gravity of the moment. Tom opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. He felt the collective gaze of the crowd pressing down on him, 1,000 unspoken judgments swirling around like a storm. A pang of guilt twisted in his chest, deeper than he had anticipated. This wasn't a harmless prank anymore. It was something far more serious. A voice crackled through the guard's earpiece, sharp and urgent, though Tom couldn't make out the words. The guard pressed a finger to his ear, responding in curt, clipped phrases. His face remained impassive, yet there was a flicker of tension now, an awareness that higher-ups had taken notice. Breaking protocol, even under dire circumstances, wasn't something taken lightly in an institution steeped in tradition. The crowd began murmuring again, a low hum of voices filled with speculation and disbelief. Some onlookers clutched their phones tightly, their screens reflecting shaky videos of the incident. Others simply stood in stunned silence, processing the gravity of what they had witnessed. A woman nearby whispered, "I've never seen them break before. Not ever." Tom swallowed hard, his shame deepening. He took a tentative step forward, pulling Max closer to his side, and cleared his throat. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." His voice was weak, almost drowned out by the ambient noise, but the guard didn't so much as glance his way. It was then that another figure emerged, another royal guard, this one of higher rank, distinguished by the markings on his uniform. He moved with purpose, weaving through the parted crowd, his eyes locked onto the scene ahead. There was a gravity to his presence, an unspoken authority that commanded attention. Reaching the shaken guard's side, the superior surveyed the scene with a sharp, assessing gaze. He took in the disheveled tourist, the still growling Pitbull, and the slight scuff on the first guard's boots, evidence of the lunge he had sidestepped moments earlier. "Explain," the superior barked, his voice low but filled with expectation. The guard, ever composed, straightened his shoulders and spoke. "The dog broke free, sir. Lunged directly at me. I took defensive action to prevent harm." A pause hung between them, thick and heavy. The superior's jaw tightened, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "You did what was necessary." It was a small acknowledgement, but profound. In a world where rules reigned supreme, recognizing the humanity behind a breach in protocol was rare. Tom, still grappling with the weight of his actions, felt the sting of tears at the corners of his eyes. Tears not of fear, but of deep, gnawing remorse. This man, trained to withstand everything, had been forced to choose between tradition and safety, all because Tom had wanted to provoke a reaction. The superior shifted his gaze to Tom now, his eyes piercing. "You're lucky," he said coldly. "If that dog had made contact, this would have ended very differently." Tom nodded vigorously, barely able to speak. I know. I'm sorry. It was stupid. I wasn't thinking." The guard who had broken protocol remained silent, but there was something almost imperceptible in his eyes, a mix of disappointment and weariness. Perhaps he had seen this kind of recklessness before, or perhaps this moment would stay with him as deeply as it would haunt Tom. The superior turned to the guard once more. "Resume your post. I'll handle this." The first guard hesitated for a fraction of a second, the smallest crack in his otherwise impenetrable facade, before returning to his original position. He adjusted his bearskin hat, squared his shoulders, and, as if flipping a switch, returned to his silent vigil. But even now, the crowd saw him differently. He was no longer just a symbol of duty and discipline. He was human, fallible, compassionate, and real. Tom stood there, the full weight of the moment crashing over him. What had begun as a misguided attempt at amusement had spiraled into a sobering confrontation with responsibility and respect. The emotions churned within him, shame, regret, and an overwhelming realization of how fragile the line between harmless fun and serious consequence could be. As security personnel approached, speaking to him in firm but measured tones, Tom barely registered their words. His focus remained on the guard, who now stood as still as ever, yet somehow entirely changed in the eyes of everyone present. The incident had revealed something raw and unexpected. The breaking point not just of protocol, but of the illusions people held about control, duty, and the choices that define who we are when pushed to the edge. The square slowly emptied, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air like an invisible fog. Tom sat on a cold stone bench, his head buried in his hands, Max lying quietly at his feet, no longer the aggressive, lunging dog from moments ago, but a calm, almost remorseful creature sensing the shift in his owner's mood. The incident replayed in Tom's mind on an endless loop. Max's sudden leap, the guard's defensive stance, the rifle raised between them, and the heavy words that followed. Each detail struck him deeper now, hitting with a sharpness that made his chest tighten. Security officers had already spoken to him, twice, about the severity of what had happened. While no charges had been pressed yet, it was made clear that this wasn't something that would just blow over. There were formalities, reports, protocols, and a string of consequences that were now trailing him like shadows. But none of that compared to the heaviness in his heart, the gnawing realization of what he'd almost caused. The square had been filled with people, families, children, tourists from all over the world. And yet, for a few terrifying moments, it had become a scene of chaos and danger. Tom couldn't stop thinking about how much worse it could have been. What if Max had actually bitten the guard? Or worse, if the guard had reacted differently, pulling the trigger in self-defense? The thought made him sick. Tom looked over at Max, who now had his head resting on his paws, his chest rising and falling gently. "You didn't know better, boy," Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But I did. I should have known better." His hand moved to Max's head, giving a soft scratch, but the weight of his regret didn't ease. Nearby, the royal guard who had broken protocol had resumed his post, as still and stoic as before, but Tom knew, just as the crowd knew, that something had shifted. Even from a distance, Tom could sense the guard's internal struggle, though it remained masked behind the polished exterior demanded by tradition. The guard's job was simple in theory: stand still, remain composed, don't react. But today, in the face of genuine danger, the lines had blurred. A gentle tap on Tom's shoulder broke his thoughts. He turned to see a woman standing there, her face etched with concern. She was older, perhaps in her late 60s, with kind eyes and a calm presence. "I saw the whole thing," she said softly. "It could have been so much worse." Tom nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I know. I wasn't thinking. I didn't mean for any of this." The woman's gaze softened even more. Sometimes we forget that these guards are real people under all that uniform and discipline. It took courage for him to step out of line today. Tom's shoulders slumped further, and I made him do that. I forced him into a position he should have never been in. The woman gave a gentle smile, the kind that conveyed understanding. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after." Her words echoed in his mind as she walked away, leaving Tom sitting there, more reflective than before. She was right. The damage was done, but what came next was still within his control. It wasn't long before two uniformed officers approached, their faces neutral but their body language firm. "Sir," one of them began, "we'll need to take a formal statement. There are protocols to follow after an incident like this." Tom nodded, standing up slowly, Max rising beside him. "Of course," he replied, his voice steadier now. "I want to make this right." As they led him toward a quieter area for the statement, Tom couldn't help but glance back at the guard. He stood there, as unmoving as before, but Tom knew better now. Beneath the uniform was a man who had been forced to make a split-second decision, one that had carried weight far beyond what anyone could have predicted. The interview with the officers was methodical. They asked about everything: where Tom was from, how long he'd been in London, why he had brought Max so close to the guard, whether the dog had any history of aggression. Each question chipped away at the layers of guilt he already carried, but he answered honestly. There was no point in lying now. When the questioning was over, one of the officers leaned in slightly, his tone softening. "You're lucky, you know. It could have gone very differently." Tom swallowed hard. "I know, and I'm sorry." The officer nodded before walking away, leaving Tom alone again with Max. The weight in his chest was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, an understanding of the deeper implications of what had happened. It wasn't just about him or the guard. It was about respect, responsibility, and recognizing the humanity behind the uniforms that people so often reduce to symbols. The following day, Tom returned to the square, not as a tourist this time, but as someone carrying the invisible scars of a lesson learned the hard way. He stood at a distance, watching the royal guards in their unbreakable lines, their faces unreadable beneath the towering bearskin hats. The guard from the previous day was there, as if nothing had changed, but Tom knew better. That guard had broken protocol, made a difficult choice, and in doing so, reminded everyone watching that even the most stoic symbols of duty are still human underneath. Tom didn't approach. He didn't try to apologize again. He simply stood there, Max by his side, watching in silence, feeling the weight of the aftermath settle in. This moment, this lesson, would stay with him forever. The days that followed were heavy, each one steeped in an oppressive mix of guilt, reflection, and an aching desire to make things right. Tom couldn't escape the images that replayed in his mind. The snap of Max's leash, the guard's firm stance, the moment the rifle had been raised. Every time he closed his eyes, the scene unfolded again, raw and unfiltered. It wasn't just the fear or the chaos that haunted him. It was the realization that, in a single reckless moment, he had forced someone else to bear the weight of a decision that could have ended in tragedy. Tom stayed in his small hotel room for most of the next day, the curtains drawn, Max curled up at his feet, unusually calm. The dog seemed to sense the shift in energy, his usual playful nature subdued. It was almost as if Max, in his own way, felt the tension hanging in the air. Tom absently stroked the dog's fur, his mind racing. "Why did I do it?" he muttered aloud, the question bouncing off the quiet walls. There was no real answer. It had seemed harmless in the moment, a bit of provocation, maybe even an innocent attempt at humor. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, it was clear how deeply flawed his judgment had been. The thought of the Royal Guard haunted him most. Tom had read about the discipline required for those positions, the grueling hours of training, the unshakable stoicism demanded on duty. Guard were meant to be unmovable symbols, detached from the distractions of the world around them. And yet, Tom had pushed one of them to a breaking point, forcing him into action, into humanity, and into breaking protocol, something that could have lasting consequences for the guard's career. The more Tom thought about it, the more he realized that an apology wasn't enough. Words were hollow without action. He had to take accountability in a meaningful way, something that extended beyond his own guilt. Later that afternoon, he began making calls, searching online for contact information. It took hours sifting through government pages and departments, but eventually he found what he needed, a way to reach out to the Royal Guard Division. It wasn't a direct line, but it was something. He hesitated before making the call, his hand trembling slightly as he held the phone. What could he possibly say that would make any of this better? A woman answered, her voice crisp and professional. "Royal Guard Administrative Offices. How may I assist you?" Tom cleared his throat, nerves prickling under his skin. "Hi. My name is Tom Harris. I was involved in an incident near Buckingham Palace 2 days ago. With my dog." There was a brief pause on the other end before she replied, her tone measured. "Yes, sir. We are aware of the incident." Of course they were. It had probably been discussed at length, reports filed, actions reviewed. "I wanted to apologize," Tom stammered. "Not just for what happened, but for putting the guard in that position. I know he broke protocol because of what I did, and his voice faltered for a moment, but he pushed through. I just want to make sure he's okay. And if there's anything I can do to make this right, I want to do it." Another pause. "I appreciate your call, Mr. Harris," she finally said. "The guard is fine, though shaken. There are internal processes for incidents like this, but your acknowledgement is noted." Her words were polite, but distant, and Tom understood why. It wasn't her job to comfort him or absolve his guilt, but at least he had tried. At least the guard might hear that he wasn't just another careless tourist who had walked away without a second thought. The call left him feeling hollow, but also strangely lighter, as if voicing his regret had taken a small part of the weight off his chest. But Tom wasn't done. He knew that accountability wasn't just about personal guilt. It was about understanding the broader impact of his actions. That evening, he sat at the hotel desk, opened his laptop, and began typing out a letter. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to formally apologize for my reckless behavior during the recent incident involving my dog near Buckingham Palace. I understand that my actions placed one of your guards in an incredibly difficult position, forcing him to choose between protocol and safety. I deeply regret the fear and disruption I caused, not only to him, but to everyone who witnessed the event. What I did was irresponsible. I should never have allowed my dog to get that close, nor should I have provoked a situation that put anyone in harm's way. I understand that the guard had to break protocol to ensure safety, and I take full responsibility for putting him in that position. Please let the guard know that I am truly sorry for the stress and professional risks he faced because of my actions. I hope that there are no lasting repercussions for him, as he handled the situation with courage and composure. I have also reflected deeply on this experience and intend to use it as a serious reminder of the importance of respecting both people and traditions. Sincerely, Tom Harris." He printed the letter the next morning and hand-delivered it to the administrative office near the palace. The receptionist accepted it with a polite nod, and Tom walked away, feeling a strange mix of relief and continued remorse. In the days that followed, Tom noticed subtle changes within himself. He paid more attention to his surroundings, respected spaces and people in ways he hadn't before. Even Max, now always on a tighter leash, seemed to mirror this new caution. Their walks were slower, more deliberate, Tom constantly aware of others around them. The incident had left a scar, but it was a necessary one. It had forced Tom to confront parts of himself that he'd ignored. The arrogance, the carelessness, the belief that some rules were flexible if the moment called for it. Now, those illusions had been stripped away, leaving behind something raw, but real. And though he would never forget the terror on that guard's face or the heaviness of the rifle raised in defense, he also wouldn't forget the lesson it had taught him about respect, responsibility, and the profound impact of even the smallest actions. Weeks had passed since the incident near Buckingham Palace, but the echoes of that day lingered within Tom like a shadow that followed him everywhere. Back home, life resumed its usual pace. The city noises, the routines, the familiar streets, but Tom wasn't the same. Something fundamental had shifted inside him. An invisible thread pulled tight, reminding him of the weight of his actions. Max, too, had changed. Once a playful, energetic Pitbull who pulled hard on his leash during every walk, he now stayed close by Tom's side. The bond between them deepened not by shared adventures, but by the shared experience of that moment in London. Tom had enrolled Max in advanced obedience training as soon as they returned home, not as a punishment, but as a symbol of responsibility, of moving forward the right way. But it wasn't just Max who needed training. Tom recognized that he had been careless, not just in that singular moment, but in how he approached life. He had coasted through experiences, often seeking a thrill without fully appreciating the spaces he entered or the people he encountered. That day at Buckingham Palace had stripped away the layers of indifference he hadn't even realized he wore. One afternoon, while sitting at a small cafe with Max curled up beneath his chair, Tom scrolled through news articles on his phone. A headline caught his eye: Royal Guard commended for courage during Buckingham Palace incident. His heart skipped as he opened the article. It described the guard's quick thinking, how he had broken protocol not out of fear, but out of an unwavering sense of responsibility. To the people in the square, to the safety of the dog, and to the integrity of his role. The article praised his composure, stating that while guards are trained to remain stoic, they are also trained to act when real danger arises. The piece ended with a quote from the guard himself, who had chosen to speak publicly about the incident. In that moment, I wasn't just a guard. I was a person making a difficult decision. Protocol is important, but so is humanity. I did what I thought was right. Tom sat back in his chair, a strange mixture of relief and guilt washing over him. The guard hadn't been reprimanded. Instead, he had been commended for his actions. Yet the feeling of responsibility still clung to Tom. He had been the one to force the guard into that position, to test the boundaries of a man whose job was to stand firm. But that quote stuck with him: protocol is important, but so is humanity. It summed up everything Tom had been grappling with since that day. Inspired, Tom began writing about the experience, not as a confession or a plea for forgiveness, but as a reflection on respect, responsibility, and the often overlooked humanity behind uniforms and traditions. He wrote an essay detailing the incident, his thoughtless actions, and the deep lessons he had learned. He submitted it to a few travel and lifestyle blogs, hoping that perhaps others could learn from his mistake without having to experience the same regret. To his surprise, one of the blogs published it, titled "The Day I Forced a Royal Guard to Break Protocol and What It Taught Me About Respect." The essay resonated with readers. Comments poured in, not with condemnation, but with stories from others who had also crossed lines, sometimes unknowingly, and the lessons they had learned afterward. One comment in particular stood out: "We often forget the weight people in uniform carry. Your story was a much-needed reminder. Thank you for sharing." It hit Tom deeply. This was his accountability, not just to the guard, but to the broader understanding of how actions, even small ones, ripple outward. The incident also changed the way Tom traveled. No longer was he the kind of tourist who sought out thrills or leaned into the idea of bending rules for a better story. He became more mindful, more respectful. Whether visiting historical landmarks, interacting with locals, or simply walking through unfamiliar streets, he approached everything with a deeper sense of awareness. Months later, Tom returned to London, not as a tourist chasing bucket list items, but as someone seeking closure. He stood again outside Buckingham Palace, Max by his side, watching the royal guards in their perfect formation. He didn't expect to see the same guard. After all, it had been months, but part of him hoped he might. And there he was. The guard who had broken protocol stood at his post, still and silent. But somehow, Tom recognized him instantly. It was in the stance, the slight, almost imperceptible shift in weight, the way his hands gripped the rifle just a little more firmly than the others. Tom stood at a respectful distance, not daring to repeat the mistakes of the past. He didn't expect a response, but he spoke anyway. "Thank you," Tom said quietly, more to himself than to the guard. "For what you did. For being human when I wasn't." The guard, as expected, didn't move, didn't flinch. But Tom felt the weight of the moment nonetheless. It wasn't about acknowledgement or forgiveness. It was about closure, about understanding the gravity of that day and how it had changed them both. As Tom turned to leave, Max trotting beside him, he felt a strange peace settle over him. The incident had been a turning point, not just in a faraway square in London, but within himself. It had taught him about respect, responsibility, and the fragile balance between tradition and humanity. And though the world had moved on, though the square was once again filled with laughing tourists and clicking cameras, Tom knew that for him, that day would always stand still, etched into his memory, a constant reminder of how a single moment can change everything. This story reminds us how a single moment can change everything, and how important it is to think before we act. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you made a split-second decision that taught you a powerful lesson? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Let's start a conversation and learn from each other.